There is a lottery ticket in my breast pocket. It is folded in quarters, the ink gone pale from 2 years of sweat, and it has never won anything. I was standing in St. Peter's on a Sunday in October of 1861 when Father Donnelly pulled the number and read it out, and it was not mine, and I laughed. 3 days later, I signed the enlistment paper, and the ticket came with me because I forgot to leave it on the pew. It has been to Virginia twice and Maryland once. It is in my breast pocket at Cemetery Ridge on the 3rd day of July, 1863, and I am loading a 3-inch ordnance rifle, and the morning is not yet finished being hot. Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery. That is what I am. The guns are 6 3-inch ordnance rifles set behind the stone wall at the angle, and Cemetery Ridge runs behind us like the spine of something enormous. The town of Gettysburg is a mile to the north, and I have not been in it, and I do not want to be in it because everything I have seen in 2 years tells me that the towns are where the bad things happen after the fighting is finished. Lieutenant Cushing is 22 years old. I am 26. He walks the line before the morning is fully light, and he checks every elevation screw himself. He does not look like a man who is afraid, and I do not know if that is because he is not afraid or because he is a lieutenant, and lieutenants are not permitted to look afraid in front of the guns. I am permitted. The bombardment began at 1 in the afternoon. I know this because Sergeant Millen had a watch, and he looked at it when the first Confederate gun fired from Cemetery Ridge, and he said 1 o'clock. Hurley, and I said yes, Sergeant. Then the second gun fired, and then the third, and then there were too many to count, and the watch did not matter anymore. 143 Confederate guns. That is what they tell us afterward. In the moment, you do not count. You press yourself against the wheel of the limber, and you feel the ground move, and you think about the angle of the ridge, and whether the ridge is tall enough, and you know that it is not tall enough, that nothing is tall enough, that the shells are dropping into the battery line. The sound is not thunder. It is something below thunder, something that happens in the chest before it happens in the ears. Corporal Egan is 4 feet to my left, and then he is not 4 feet to my left anymore. I do not look. You learn, in 2 years, what to look at and what not to look at. The ticket is in my breast pocket, and I am pressing my face against the iron wheel, and the ground is moving under me in a way that I associate now with the end of things. I think about October of 1861 and Father Donnelly pulling the number from the hat. I think the number was 37, and my number was 41, and the difference between 37 and 41 is 4. I've been thinking about small differences for 2 years, and the distance between alive and not alive is always a small difference. It is always 4. The bombardment lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes. That is what they tell us afterward. When it stopped, the silence was not silence. It was the interval. I have learned to dread the interval more than the bombardment. The bombardment is noise and pressure, and you cannot think. The interval is the moment when thought returns, and thought, on the 3rd of July 1863, was not a thing I wanted returned to me. Sergeant Millen stood up. He was a large man from County Cork, and he had been in the regular army since 1854, and he had the manner of a man who has made a decision about fear a long time ago and does not revisit it. He stood up from behind the stone wall, and he looked west towards Cemetery Ridge, and he said quietly, to no one in particular, "They are coming." I stood up and looked. Across 3/4 of a mile of open Pennsylvania farmland, through the last of the bombardment smoke still hanging in the afternoon air, the Confederate line was forming. I had seen formations before. I had seen the Irish Brigade go forward at Antietam from 400 yards away, and I had thought then that a line of men walking into fire was the most terrible thing I had ever seen. And I was wrong. What I was looking at now was not a line. It was a wall. It was a field of grey that stretched from the Emmitsburg Road north to the Cadori Farm and beyond. Flags every 30 yards. They were not walking yet. They were standing, and the standing was somehow worse than the walking would be. 12,500 men. Sergeant Millen told me this number later. In the moment, I did not count. I only understood that it was more men than I had ever seen moving together in one direction, and that they were moving toward me. Between them and me, there was nothing except Pennsylvania grass and 3/4 of a mile and 6 3-inch ordnance rifles and whatever I was made of. Lieutenant Cushing gave his orders quietly. This is what I remember most clearly, more clearly than the guns or the smoke or the sound. He walked behind the battery line and he spoke in a voice that was almost conversational, and he said, "Load with canister." I loaded with canister. He said, "Wait until they cross the Emmitsburg Road." I waited. I had been a foundry worker in Albany before the war. My father poured iron. I understand now, in a way I did not understand when I signed the paper, why that was useful training, because the work of a gun crew is foundry work. It is the same grammar, the same attention to sequence, the same understanding that if you do the steps out of order, something goes wrong in a way that cannot be corrected after the fact. Ram the charge. Ram the projectile. Step clear. Fire. The Confederate line began to move. I watched them come. At 600 yards, they were a grey line, moving through the smoke of their own bombardment. Flags forward, dressed on the colours the way a parade dresses. I thought, they have rehearsed this. Somewhere they have rehearsed walking in a straight line across a field toward cannon, and they have decided that if the line stays straight long enough, they will reach the wall. At 400 yards, our artillery to the north and south opened on their flanks, and the line did not stop. At 300 yards, the line crossed the Gettysburg Road, and Lieutenant Cushing said fire. The canister round from a 3-inch ordnance rifle contains 76 iron balls, packed in a tin case that disintegrates at the muzzle. I know this number. It is the number I know the way a man knows his age or the price of bread in his neighbourhood. It is a number that has no arithmetic to it anymore. It is just a fact of my life, 76. At 200 yards I fired. The smoke came up immediately, dense and white, and I could not see what the canister did at 200 yards. I could only see the smoke. I swabbed the barrel and Sergeant Millen slammed the next charge in and I rammed it and stepped clear and Cushing said fire and I fired again. The sequence takes 11 seconds when the crew is working well. We were working well. I did not look beyond the smoke. I have tried to explain this to men who are not there and they do not understand it. They think that a man in battle watches what his gun does, watches the results, and this is wrong. There is no time to watch results. There is only the sequence. Swab, charge, ram, step, fire, and the sequence is its own world, a world with edges I understood completely. I stayed inside that world because the other world, the world past the smoke at 200 yards, was a world I did not have the capacity to see and continue. I continued. At 100 yards, Lieutenant Cushing was hit the first time. I did not see it. Sergeant Millen told me afterward. A bullet through the shoulder. He kept the line. He moved to a position just behind the stone wall and he sighted the gun himself, kneeling on the ground, and the blood was coming through his coat, and he did not move back. At 70 yards, we were loading double canister. 2 rounds stacked in the barrel, 152 iron balls per discharge, and the recoil was enough to move the gun back 18 inches on its own. I stepped in after each shot and pushed the wheel forward, and the wheel was hot from the barrel, and I could feel the heat through my palms. My hands were black from powder. I remember this specifically, the blackness of my hands, because I noticed it in a way that seemed strange. I thought about my father's hands at the end of a shift, the way the iron dust lived in the lines of his palms and knuckles. I thought my hands looked like his hands now, and I did not know what to do with that thought, so I rammed the next charge. At 50 yards, the smoke was total. I could not see the stone wall from the gun. I could hear shouting beyond the smoke, the sound of men running over broken ground, the sound of voices I could not make out the words of. I understood from the pitch of the sound that whatever was beyond the smoke was very close. I loaded and fired and the gun recoiled and I stepped forward and pushed the wheel. Lieutenant Cushing was hit again, this time through the groin. Sergeant Millen said he kept standing. He said Cushing pushed the gun forward to the wall himself, bleeding through 2 wounds, and fired the last round into the Confederate infantry at point-blank range. Then, a bullet came through his mouth, and he went down. And that was the end of Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, 22 years old, Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery. The Confederate infantry came over the wall. I did not see any of this. I was at the gun. The gun was my world, and I stayed in it. What I know of the next 4 minutes, I know from the shape of it, rather than the sight of it. The sound of bayonets on stone, the sound of men very close in smoke, the sound of orders I could not identify as Union or Confederate. Then the sound shifted, the quality of the shouting changed, and through the smoke I could see figures moving back, figures moving west, figures crossing the Pennsylvania grass in the direction they had come from. I understood from this that we had held the angle. That is what they call it. The place where the wall made a corner and the Confederate line broke and the charge ended and the war did not end, but something ended. Something that had been building for 3 days and perhaps for 2 years ended at that corner of that wall. I sat down against the wheel of the gun. My hands were shaking. I did not notice this while I was working. I notice it now, sitting in the grass at Cemetery Ridge, with the smoke still lying over the field to the west and the sun beginning to move toward the Blue Ridge, and my hands shaking in a way I cannot stop. 7 men in Battery A were killed or wounded. I was not among them. I do not have a reason for this. I have thought about it for 20 years, and I do not have a reason. Egan was 4 feet to my left, and a shell took him in the first hour, and I was at the wheel, and I am here, and he is not here, and there is no arithmetic that explains the distance between 4 feet and the distance between alive and not. The lottery ticket is in my breast pocket. I put my hand on it through the cloth, the way you put your hand on a thing to make sure it has not moved, and it has not moved. It is there. folded in quarters, the ink gone pale, the number 41 still on it somewhere under the sweat and the powder and the 2 years. I did not win anything. Father Donnelly pulled 37. I kept the ticket because I forgot to leave it on the pew. They brought Cushing's body back past the guns at dusk. He was 22 years old and he had held the line. The record will say that. The record will say Battery A, 4th U.S. Artillery, held the angle against Pickett's charge on the 3rd of July, 1863. And it will say that Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing died at the wall, and it will say the names of the men killed and wounded, and somewhere in the rolls it will say Hurley, James, Gunner, present, no wounds recorded. Present. That is the word the record uses. I was present. I loaded the gun and fired the gun and swabbed the barrel and loaded again, and 76 iron balls at 200 yards became 152 at 50 yards, and I did not look past the smoke because there was no version of looking past the smoke that would have helped me do the thing I was there to do. I am not certain this was right. I am not certain it was wrong. I am certain I was present and that the line held, and that Lieutenant Cushing was 22 years old and walked behind the battery before the charge came and checked every elevation screw himself because he was the kind of man who checked the elevation screws himself, and that I am 26 and sitting in the grass at Cemetery Ridge with powder-black hands and a lottery ticket in my breast pocket that has never won anything. The sun is going down over the Blue Ridge. The smoke is still. Somewhere across the field, in the Pennsylvania grass between here and the Emmitsburg Road, 12,500 men began a walk this morning, and not all of them finished it. And I fired 76 iron balls at the ones who came within 200 yards of where I was standing, and I do not know their names, and they do not know mine, and the record will not record any of this. Somewhere in Albany, Father Donnelly is saying the evening mass. He does not know what the number 41 survived today. I put my hand on my breast pocket. The ticket is there. I leave it there.